Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising episode. I'm pleased to welcome Katy McMinn from the HR Independents, and she's going to be taking us through one of our HR's role-in series. And today we're going to be talking about HR's role in grievances. I guess we'd like to not have to deal with these, I'm imagining. Katy, just in case people haven't heard you before, I know you've been on the podcast a few times. Do you want to give yourself a brief introduction and then let's position and grievances as to how we manage those?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi there. Thanks very much for having me on today, Lucinda. So yes, just to introduce myself. So Katy McMinn, I'm one of the co-founders and directors of HR Independents. HR Independents, we're the UK body for independent HR and people professionals in the UK. So our aim really provide lots of resources and support to those working externally, running their own consultancies, and really helping them to develop and grow their businesses as profitably as possible. So lots of support and community around that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and this is one of the things that's lovely about working with you guys. We've been working in partnership is that you have got great resources, some great partners. And with that in mind, this topic is one of many specialist topics that we're covering with you, and we'll direct people to your website if they want to download reference material on these as well. So sort of quick guides amongst other resources that you have there as well, and even more for members, of course. So Let's dive straight in, Katy, because I have talked to Ruth about disciplinaries and as to how we might manage those. And I have to say, I've been involved even back in my corporate career in disciplinaries. I never had to get involved in a grievance. So could you just demystify the difference between these?
So yes, they do often get sort of lumped together, don't they, under the same umbrella, but they obviously are very different things. As you rightly say, they're not something that most people in business want to deal with, but it's inevitable at some point in time they may crop up. So it's about understanding what they are and how to deal with them. So really, grievances, the purpose of grievances and having a policy, it's about providing employees with a formal route to voice any issues that they may be having in the workplace that they either haven't been able to resolve informally themselves, or they may have tried and that hasn't worked, or potentially that actually the issue might be of such a serious nature that it's not appropriate that individual should have to try and resolve it informally themselves. And so it's basically providing the opportunity for an individual to raise concerns, to raise issues they've got, and for those to be looked into by the employer on their behalf.
Does every business have a grievance policy in the same way as you should have a disciplinary policy?
Yes, yeah. They should have one. It's one of the real key policies that you need to have in place. Yeah.
So if you have a company handbook, let's say, it would have a disciplinary policy and a grievance policy if somebody should do.
That's right. That's right. Yes, absolutely. Sometimes I will say, and certainly I know other HR consultants who listen to this podcast will no doubt come across some smaller organisations. And that's the thing with, many HR consultants, they will be brought in to do some of the firefighting. So they might not have necessarily worked with an organisation before, but they get brought in if a grievance has been raised. And then they find out, okay, there isn't a policy there. If that's the case, don't panic too much. It's about making sure that actually, okay, well, it's down to the organisation to follow what we call the Actus code, and that is the sort of the minimum level for any organisation.
So that basically that's there, even if you haven't got something.
Yes.
That's there to what does it stand for? Is it who protects employees? Is it Actus?
It's the Actus code. It's basically a code by which employers should adhere to. It sets out what the proper process is, what the proper steps are, what employers are entitled to within any process, and that would override any company policy if, for example, a company policy didn't provide the right level of sort of support and things like that.
Okay, cool. So whether it's there or not, there is something that we should follow. So you've got called in, or a grievance has someone's registered a grievance. What would they have done to flag that?
Typically how it starts is somebody will, I mean, there's different ways that it could come up. Sometimes a grievance will appear out of nowhere. A manager will suddenly receive a letter on their desk saying, I'm raising a grievance. Nobody wants to get that letter, but it sometimes does happen like that out of the blue. Other times it may be that an employee comes to, say, a line manager or someone else within the organisation to say, look, this has happened, complaining about something or voicing a serious concern. And that's the point where, a manager will look at it and say, right, well, if you've tried to resolve it and it hasn't worked, then you can raise a grievance. And it's important to let people know that they have the opportunity to do that. And so how a grievance needs to be presented is an employee should put that in writing to the appropriate person. It might be their line manager. It's usually their line manager. But obviously, sometimes we know that a grievance might be against their line manager. So if that's the case, it's somebody else, either somebody more senior or somebody at the same level as their manager. Or obviously, HR is the other obvious channel as well. So that's
so the person. So if someone said they've got something and they come and say, I've got a complaint or something. It's only when they formally call it a grievance, and then or if they're kind of moaning about something, can you put it in writing? Is what you need to. You have to have it put in writing as a grievance.
Yes, it needs to be in writing. It might be an email as long as it's in writing, but it should say, and again, typically what you would say is if an employee is saying, I want to raise this as a concern, then the advice is, right, well, first of all, let's see if we can resolve this informally, because sometimes, if there's just a little bit of conflict between two employees, let's try and sort this out. Let's try and work together.
Yes.
And that is what we want to be able to try and do. But it's recognizing that, first of all, some people may not be prepared to go down that route and they want to raise it formally, or it's not appropriate, they don't feel comfortable doing it, or they've tried and it's failed. So that's when you would say to them, if they haven't, right, well, if you would like to raise a grievance, please can you pop it in writing, and just stating what it is, what the allegations are, what the grievances actually are, and that will come to whoever that person is, and then hopefully HR or will be sort of involved in that, or if it's an organisation you're going in as external HR, then you'll sort of be contacted to say, right, we've been handed this. What do we do? So that's when the next step there is to say, right, well, let's have a look at this grievance. Let's see what it's all about, and let's start dealing with this in terms of a proper process. So the first thing to think about is, bearing in mind what that grievance is about, is who actually is going to be involved in this grievance. So you're going to have to think about that. Obviously, you've got the employee, the line manager would be involved in some way, usually in terms of hearing a grievance, or, as I say, sometimes they might be involved themselves, so they would take a slightly separate role. There's different roles. You might need somebody you would need somebody to investigate the grievance, and also really important to have somebody lined up for further down the line in case there's any appeal, and we'll come on to that, but somebody who's not involved, so keep somebody separate. And I know that certainly with smaller organisations, this is where it can be quite challenging. If you haven't got too many people, how do you sort of work out who does what? And that's where actually it can be really, really helpful, if you're a small business, to involve somebody externally. They can take on the management of that. It's done in a very objective way. There can be no sort of claims of any bias coming into it, that kind of thing. So thinking about some of those key roles, but the first thing to do once you've had a look at that grievance is make sure that you understand it. So look at what that person's been put down on paper. And it's really important at this stage as well, just to remember that actually the person that is sort of filing this grievance, they may never have written a letter like this before. They may never have had to do that. So sometimes, you know, and I know certainly grievances that I've seen, they can be a little bit of a brain dump, and it can be quite tricky to work out, right, what's actually going on here. So having a lots
of emotion in it, potentially.
Lots of emotion, yeah, lots of emotion. So pulling out, right, okay, what's actually going on here? And then you need to invite that person to a grievance hearing, and that's what they're called. Basically, a grievance hearing is a meeting for them to talk through what it is, what their grievance is. So you would invite them to a meeting, to a hearing in writing, and after looking at the grievance they've raised, try and pull that apart to say, right, and to summarize what actually is the grievance. It might be just one grievance. Sometimes you'll find there's a few different points sort of all thrown in together, so you might need to break that out. So getting that, summarizing what the grievance is that they've raised, inviting them to a hearing as quickly as possible, really, so that they know that it's being taken seriously and they're going to be heard, and making sure also that they know they can be accompanied to that meeting as well. So that should all go into the letter. So they would, and again, you know, that's where it can be helpful to have somebody external that then leads this process. So they'd be invited to a hearing, and this is where basically they would think about, you would sit the person down. You would have also just asked them to confirm, you know, if that the way that you've understood the grievance is correct, or if anything has been misunderstood. And then just letting that person talk it through, asking them to talk it through in their own words, so that you can really properly understand the nature of it. And a key thing here is really just to make sure that whoever's hearing that grievance, whether it is a line manager, whether it is somebody external or somebody else within the organisation, is to really go into it with an open mind, without having made any assumptions as well. There's, you know, whilst also, you know, understanding the background to it. So sometimes you will see that if somebody, for example, is going through a disciplinary process, sometimes a grievance might be raised whilst that's happening. Now, that can sometimes lead a line manager to think, oh, they're just raising a grievance now to try and delay the disciplinary. Yes, that might be the case, but also it might not be the case. It might be a very, you know, a very reasonable grievance, and a very, you know, a specific one that needs to be looked into. So don't jump to conclusions. At the same time, you know, be open to the fact that, you know, there might be other reasons that are driving this. So it's being objective, it's being open-minded, and just listening to what's being said. So that's, you know, that's just some sort of.
I mean, you do see that. I was just thinking, or I hear that. I'm trying to think with some of the businesses I've worked with, particularly very large organisations, unionised organisations, they might almost have a culture of grievances. So as soon as somebody, and I am stereotyping, but this is kind of here, yeah, as soon as somebody is managed, they're taken, let's say, into a performance management, they're underperforming, they're being managed, you know, fairly in line with the performance management process, then they'll raise a grievance. It's almost a kind of cascade, and that a well-trodden path of cascade, or that's the perception that goes with it.
Yeah, and it's being aware of that, but again, you know, as I say, not jumping to those conclusions, and then thinking about that. Yeah, if that is going on, you know, if there is, for example, a disciplinary process that's in play and a grievance is raised, it doesn't always necessarily mean that the disciplinary process has to be stopped. Sometimes it may be appropriate to do that, but again, it's looking at each situation uniquely to say, right, well, actually, is this relevant? Does this actually have any bearing on the disciplinary process? If it does, it might be the right thing to do to pause that whilst you investigate the grievance. But if it's something separate, again, sometimes they can run concurrently as well. So yeah, it's just good to sort of understand the background there. So in that hearing, as I say, let the person explain what's going on in their own words. Don't try and put words in their mouth, but making sure that you know, once they've gone through that actually you look back at how you've broken that grievance down. Have you covered all of those points? And have you got a clear understanding of exactly what the grievance is that they're raising, what the points are, who's involved, all of that kind of thing? And also making sure that you've got somebody there to take minutes of the meeting as well. That's, you know, sometimes you can try and do it yourself whilst you're chairing the meeting, but it's incredibly difficult, and it's not allowing you to properly focus on the discussion. So wherever possible, if you can have somebody who's taking some notes, and then that means that they can be shared with all parties afterwards to make sure that everybody's in agreement as well. You've got that as a written record of the meeting, and that can be that's obviously really helpful.
Just on that,
well.
So one of the things that Ruth stressed when we talked about the disciplinaries one is it's not really the HR person who's doing the disciplinary. They would be there as a neutral person. Well, the manager should be holding it. Is that the same thing with the grievance, but with this chairing concept, or
so it can be a little bit different, actually. I mean, yes, absolutely. The line manager may well be doing it, or somebody else if the line manager is implicated. But actually, with a grievance, what can work quite nicely for organisations if they don't have in-house HR support is by appointing somebody externally. You're bringing them in from the outside. They're completely objective. They're going to hear this grievance and then go away and investigate it. And their job, and we'll come on to the investigation, their job is to look into each of those allegations or the grievances that have been raised, gather evidence to make a decision. And they're not biased in any way. They haven't got any of any sort of baggage internally, and it can just also provide a huge amount of sort of reassurance to the person that's raised that grievance that it is being taken seriously, and it is being looked into in an objective way by having somebody externally do that. It's a really good sort of common piece of work that a lot of external HR consultants will be brought in to do.
And how does that fit with, because I also have podcasts which by the time this goes out will have gone out, with a guy called Pete Colby, who's a mediator.
Oh yeah.
So how would they fit into something like this?
So it's a really good point. So and we'll come back to it as well in a second. But in terms of mediation, when an investigation's been, so a grievance has been heard, an investigation takes place, and then decisions will be made on whether the grievance is either upheld or not. Then whoever has completed that investigation, again, certainly if it's an external HR consultant, what they would typically do is come up with, regardless of what the outcome is, whether the grievances have been upheld or not, what they could also do is come up with some recommendations of how this can be resolved going forwards. And a really good one is mediation. So certainly if there's conflict between two employees, how are you going to resolve that? Actually, mediation can be incredibly effective at bringing those people together, working out what are the issues, how can we sort of break those down, how can they work through that to then develop a good working relationship going forwards. And then as you say, somebody like Pete, that's where he would come in and he would work with those parties, and he will probably often go in these situations where a grievance has been raised, and that's one of the recommendations that's come out of the process.
Cool. Okay, that's useful to link it all together for me. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's also just in terms of the hearing. Sorry, just one thing I was going to say as well. Just in terms of the hearing as well, it's really, really important to recognise that it takes a lot of courage actually sometimes to raise a grievance. And as you mentioned before, there's a lot of emotion involved, and that hearing in itself can be quite a stressful time for the employee. So whoever's hearing that, just taking that into consideration and just making sure that that the individual is offered the opportunity to take a break if required, and thinking about where are you going to hold that meeting as well. That's quite important. Obviously with restrictions and things, some of them might be happening video conference like that anyway, yes. But if you are in the office, just thinking about location, it sounds really obvious, but it's incredible how it still happens. You don't want to hold a meeting like this that's really
everyone will
visible.
see you in the meeting room together.
With
the walk past the person you've got the grievance against when you go to the toilet or something.
Yeah, exactly. So just a little bit of thought there as well.
Yes, yeah. I'm sure that's happened more than once.
Yeah,
right, okay,
absolutely.
So then you've got to work out whether you've got to work out whether you uphold grievances, right, don't you?
Yeah.
So so you have to investigate. What do you do? What does that really mean?
Yeah, so you've had the hearing, you've got a full understanding of what the grievance or grievances are that the individuals have raised, and then it's about going away to actually look into each of those. And the nature of the grievance will dictate how that investigation is done. So, for example, if it is that somebody's claiming, I don't know, bullying, for example, or harassment, then the likelihood is you're going to have to interview people. So, part of that hearing will actually be, have you got any proof of this? Have you got anybody that I should be talking to? Anybody that's witnessed this that I can speak to. So a lot of investigations will usually involve interviewing other colleagues, interviewing other team members to understand whether they've seen anything, heard anything, as well. Looking at any other material that might be relevant, any emails, for example, text messages, all those kind of things as well. So whoever is conducting that investigation, I mean, in a way, the way you should approach this really, it's as in when the police are looking into a criminal investigation, they're looking at right, what is the specifics that I'm investigating here, and where's the evidence, and it's exactly the same. So once you've got that understanding, looking at that grievance, and then either as I say, interviewing or any other sort of potential evidence that's there, reviewing all of that as well. Another thing to think about as well, just when you are doing the investigation, is thinking again. It will be dictated by the specific situation and grievance. But if, for example, somebody's lodged a grievance against another employee, a colleague or a manager, something like that, it's always worth thinking, right, is it appropriate to suspend that individual whilst the allegations are being investigated? Now, very, very important to remember that if you do go down that route, it is not disciplinary action. You are not saying that person is guilty, but it is about making sure that all individuals are safe, feel supported. And if you do decide to suspend somebody, making sure it's for as short a duration as necessary, as I say, with no assumptions of guilt, until that investigation has been completed.
What would make you suspend? What sort of grievance would make you suspend somebody?
So a grievance, for example, if somebody has been, one that I dealt with a little while ago, where we did suspend the individual, is somebody had raised a grievance against an individual around bullying, but also as part of that there was physical intimidation as well. And so it was felt that actually, because of the serious nature, this person was feeling threatened, was feeling unsafe with this person in the office. That other individual was suspended on full pay whilst it was investigated. Explained to them very clearly that this isn't an assumption of guilt, but for all parties concerned, it's better to suspend you whilst we investigate it, so that we can look into everything. So that was one example. So it's things like that. If, for example, I'm trying to think of another one. If there's harassment, it's where. It's about protecting people, basically. If there's, for example, and I'm sure, I don't know whether Ruth mentioned one like this, because this can happen with disciplinaries as well. For example, if somebody is being investigated for potential fraud or something like that, they may be suspended whilst that's investigated as well. So there's different scenarios.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay, so that, yeah. And so it's obviously horse. And sorry, I'll take just a curiosity question. In your experience, what proportion of grievances are upheld? What's in your, is it 50-50? Does it tend to be not? Or
I don't know whether I could give a percentage, actually. I mean, what I will say is, in all honesty, it can be difficult. It can be difficult because often it's one word against another's.
Yeah.
And so when you investigate a grievance, you've got to find the evidence to either substantiate it or not. And for a grievance to be upheld, there does need to be that clear evidence. It can't literally be the word of one employee over another. And it can't be just based on sort of the personal opinion of the person investigating, either thinking, oh, well, gosh, I think I believe them more than that. So, it's and that's why it's really important to make sure that whoever is investigating it is being totally objective, so that it is very fair. But as I say, the issue is you can't uphold a grievance unless there is clear evidence to support it, and that might be witness statements, it might be emails that are evidence of sort of bullying or harassment, that kind of thing. So it's being really, really clear that you've got that evidence to back up the decision. And then once you've completed that investigation, what would then come out of that is you'd need to compile an investigation report. And that needs to be a good detailed document, again, very objectively written, that clearly outlines each grievance in turn, if there's more than one, confirming exactly how it was investigated, what means were taken, who was interviewed, and any evidence that's there to support each of those grievances. And you can either uphold it fully. Sometimes they can be partially upheld or not upheld. And also it's important to recognise as well that sometimes, as I say, a lot of info will be provided when somebody does file a grievance, and in some situations you'll find that, okay, well, if it's broken down into points, grievance 1 and 2, yes, they are upheld, but actually 3 and 4, there isn't enough evidence to support those. So it's just being clear, it's not an all or nothing as well. Okay.
And then just flipping again, sorry, I know I'm taking it slightly. Right. So if you've got someone and I've raised a grievance against my line manager, for argument's sake, for bullying and harassment, and you've investigated it, and actually you have decided you're going to uphold my grievance, what happens to that person? Do they then go into the disciplinary process? What do you do to that person? Yes.
So if an investigation concludes that there is clear evidence that manager has been bullying or has been harassing, then the outcome of that investigation is then that line manager would be subject to the disciplinary process. So that's when you would then flip over to that disciplinary policy and process. They'd be invited to a disciplinary hearing. They'd obviously have the opportunity to state their case as well. But that's when the disciplinary process would come into it.
So the grievance really needs to be about something that fits into I'm trying to think whether you'd ever have a grievance against somebody that wouldn't fit into disciplinary process. A grievance against somebody for
sometimes it could be a grievance. Sometimes it could be a grievance against a company policy, or the company hasn't been adhering to a company policy, for example.
Okay. So it's not always a person.
So it's not always a person. No, it can be about different things. So for example, it could be that, I'm trying to think, an internal recruitment process, for example. Somebody could raise a grievance or promotion that they don't feel that a fair process has been followed, that they weren't given the right opportunity. So that wouldn't necessarily, sometimes it could be against a specific individual, but it could be about the overall process policy. So if that was upheld, then potential outcomes for that could be a review of the recruitment policy, a review of the promotion process within that organisation, which might end up in a redraft, a new process being designed and implemented. So that's an example. It's not always against a person. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, fine. So sorry, I keep taking you off track. So where are we up to? It's just interesting kind of thinking about it's just the nuances of how this works.
Yeah, so exactly.
Then what happens next then? Is that it?
So once you've completed the investigation, you've pulled that investigation report together, then you then move to what we call sort of the outcome step in the process. So the employee who's raised a grievance should have a copy of that report so that they can see how it's all been investigated. As well as written confirmation of the outcome of the investigation. So as I mentioned, it may be that the grievance is upheld, or one of the grievances they raised was upheld or partially upheld. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where the report may also make recommendations for consideration in terms of how things could be resolved, whether there are any steps the organisation could consider to try and prevent any sort of similar issues in the future. Thinking there, if there was something around potentially, the equality side of things or discrimination, what could the organisation do? Yes, it might be that there's disciplinary action if it's upheld against a specific individual, but what does the organisation need to do on a wider scale? Is it that they need to review some of their processes? Is it that they need more focus on equality and the sort of the EDI side of things, more training for managers, that kind of thing. So there's those sort of recommendations as well that can come out of it. So again, so an outcome would go out to the individual in writing, confirming what the decision is, and sharing that report. And also it's really clear in that one to ensure that they know the employee can appeal the decision if they don't agree, and if they don't, and if they feel that it hasn't been dealt with properly. Again, it will depend on your policy here. Typically, you would invite somebody to the outcome hearing, to go through that and explain and go through the report and deal with any questions that they've got as well. If they do decide to appeal, this goes back to what I mentioned right at the start, is thinking early on in the process. Right, this might go to appeal. Do we have somebody that's going to be able to hear that? And if so, let's try and keep them out of discussions, so that when they do come on board, to participate at the appeal stage, they again can be as objective as possible. They haven't been involved throughout.
So sometimes that's about trying to keep the senior. I know it's hard in smaller businesses, but trying to keep them senior person. I remember they used to sort of say, don't take your boss to the initial stage, bring someone sort of on the same level or more neutral.
Yeah, you want to try. Yeah, you want to try and keep. Yeah, you want to try and keep someone separate. And again, as you say, recognizing sometimes it's not always possible to have that in small businesses. I've worked with businesses where they haven't had somebody, so they've asked somebody from the board who isn't involved in the day-to-day, a non-exec sometimes, who might be able to facilitate to take that role. Again, if you are using sort of external HR support, then that's when you can reach out to their network, to their team, to say, right, I need somebody who can hear an appeal. Or if you haven't used external HR support up until this point, that's another time where it can be really helpful. You bring somebody in, again, completely neutral, to hear the appeal as well. So so just making sure that they know that they can appeal if they do decide to. You've got somebody lined up. They would be invited to an appeal hearing that would be chaired by this person, and making sure if anybody does appeal that they need to clearly outline in writing on what grounds they're appealing as well. What is it that they're appealing against? Was it the process? Was it the investigation, how it was conducted, things like that? And then the appeal would be heard, and then the person hearing that appeal would then make a decision as to whether the appeal was upheld or not. And there typically would be no further right of appeal. Again, you'd need to check your individual policy there, but typically after that appeal process, there's no right of further appeal, and making sure that that's always provided in writing to them. So it's just really important. It's just really important to follow the process. So because what you want to do is, protecting your business, you want to make sure that this is sort of watertight, that you have followed it to the letter, that you can show that you've followed a fair process, that you've done all of the things that you need to do. And, where things have been uncovered, where there are issues, making sure that actually you take action, because it's remembering that sometimes employees have to be very brave to raise a grievance. Yeah. And actually, if they are raising things and they're found to be upheld, then it's in the best interest of the business to address these and deal with them. So just taking that into account as well.
You'd like to be in the sort of organisation that people could raise things without them being grievances and they get fixed, right? But
Yeah. And, and that's, this isn't, having a grievance policy isn't there to prevent people trying to deal with things informally. That should always be encouraged. And as you say, you want people to feel that they can do that on a day-to-day basis, because you know what, we're all human. We will all disagree at some point. Yeah. It's about doing that in a respectful way, isn't it? But it's just allowing and making sure that employees do have that route to go down if things can't be resolved in that way, or if they don't feel comfortable doing it, or if it's, as I say, of a serious nature that it's not appropriate to try and do it in that way.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Katie. So again, yeah, one of those, I don't think you necessarily want to, but you've got to follow the process. It's you've got to. It's not quite common sense. It is common sense, but it's very much about being delicate. If you sort of, it's very much about your empathy and your objectivity, and just being very self-aware as to not
That's
getting
right. Yes.
on it.
Yeah. It's that, and it's all of those things, and it's also just about being very methodical as well, and just always having that policy sort of there to make sure that you are kind of going through that
detail. Keep me along.
Keep me away from it. Because you don't want to miss something, even though you've got the best of intentions, but you skip over something without meaning to. Yeah,
because actually, if you did do that and they went further, you could end up in a tribunal because you didn't follow the process. I'm assuming.
That's right.
You really
That's right.
Yeah. So the consequences are high if you don't do it.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, fine. So methodical. Get someone with you if you're not methodical. Get someone who writes a note.
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. Thanks ever so much,
All
Katie.
right.
Again, another great
pleasure.
Take Charles role in. Explain to me why I was an L&D person rather than an HR person. Frankly, I would be rubbish. So it's been brilliant having an expert on to explain it to me. Thanks so much for your time once again, Katie.
Thanks.
As ever, guys, if you want to link in with Katy McMinn, we'll put all the links on the show notes, hruprising.com. I'm sure you know where that is by now. And also we'll link to the HRI website where there's those crib sheets that you can download for free. Super. Thanks so much, Katie.
Thank you.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.